We circle back to the Republic, and today we take up the speech of Socrates. It's clear that Socrates' speech picks up many of the themes that have been developed and put on the table by the earlier speakers. It's also clear that Socrates' speech brings some of these issues to a new level. Let me talk some in a general way about what's happening here. The speech that we skipped over was the speech of Agathon's. Agathon gives a speech about how Eros is just like, well, Agathon, young and beautiful. And Agathon goes so far as to say that love, Eros, always flees from those who are old and ugly. And it could not have escaped the notice of anybody at this symposium that just as Agathon was the youngest and the most beautiful man there, so too the oldest and ugliest man there was Socrates, who just happened to be sharing the same couch as Agathon. Now, you remember back at the beginning of the dialogue that when Socrates arrived at Agathon's house, there was some banter between them about the nature of wisdom. Socrates praised extravagantly the wisdom of Agathon that had just been displayed by Agathon's victory in the dramatic competition, in the tragedies. Agathon saw that Socrates was teasing him, but at that point in the dialogue, Agathon did not want to distract from the dinner party in order to carry on this debate with Socrates. So what he said to Socrates was, "We'll take up the question of which of us is wiser later, and then we'll let Dionysus judge." The god Dionysus, as Shelley translates it into the Roman god Bacchus. Agathon's gesture there, who will judge the wisdom of philosophy in its debate with poetry? Agathon's question there about who will judge is answered with a god, and in particular with the god that we saw had been rigorously excluded by Eryximachus, the medical man, when they start to give these manly, rational, sober speeches about the nature of this intoxicating experience we call erotic love. So, Agathon says, let Dionysus judge the question of wisdom between my poetic understanding of love and you, Socrates, your philosophical understanding of love. The dialogue asks us then to introduce into our own judgment of Socrates' speech, so much of which is a critique of Agathon's poetic speech. The dialogue asks us to introduce a judgment that it figures or prefigures as the judgment of Dionysus. Now, we remember that Dionysus is the god both of wine, more generally of ecstasy and intoxication, but also the god of theater. So that to invoke Dionysus as a judge is to see the action of this dialogue as an action like a dramatic competition, the sort of competition that Agathon has just won. And of course, at the point that Agathon invoked Dionysus as a judge, we did not know that these men would feel so hungover from the previous night's party that they would try to deny Dionysus his normal place within a symposium through the experience of drinking together. So when Dionysus is invoked as a judge by Agathon, we're to expect both that the claims of wisdom will be evaluated within a competition, a performance, a display that reminds us of dramatic performance, so that each speaker will, so to speak, be putting on a play of his own view of the nature of erotic love. But also the claim that a certain kind of wisdom is available to us about erotic love only if we're willing to become intoxicated. Only if we're willing to countenance the possibilities of a kind of ecstasy, a losing of our normal sobriety, a threat to our identities. We saw this theme worked over in Plato's other great erotic dialogue, the Phaedrus. We see it emerging here again in the Symposium. Socrates' speech begins when Socrates interrogates Agathon. But then, oddly enough, much of the interrogation of Agathon is repeated. But this time Socrates says, Agathon, I used to have views about love a lot like you did. But then I met somebody who taught me what the nature of erotic love really is. And Socrates plays back for us his own experience of learning, which it turns out is very much like the experience Agathon has just gone through, learning from Socrates. But most strikingly of all, it turns out that Socrates' teacher was a woman, the woman Diotima. Now, what's going on in this context? We've seen the earlier exclusion of Dionysus, but we remember too the earlier exclusion of Aphrodite and of all things musical and feminine from this group of sober men. The flute girl was excluded. Socrates, at least in speech, now does something that confronts that exclusion. He introduces his own guide into the truth of erotic life as a woman. In this respect, Socrates inherits something and drives it to a new level that was introduced by Aristophanes' speech. You remember that Aristophanes introduced the notion that at least some important part of human erotic life cannot be all male. We have to allow for the female, and in particular, we have to allow for the androgynous. Socrates takes that theme and turns it into biography or autobiography. Socrates himself has learned everything he knows about Eros from a woman. So, this odd repetition, first Socrates examines Agathon, then Diotima examines Socrates, with so much of the same themes, the same thematic material. This is a way of Socrates putting himself into a position that his own autobiography with Diotima codes as female. Socrates, however manly he may be, enacts in the sight of all of these men at the symposium the fact that he's now going to do with Agathon, or he has just done with Agathon, what a woman did with him. The theme of the interpenetration of something we would normally think of as masculine with something we would normally think of as feminine is then a part of the drama of Socrates' own speech. A second theme that we've seen in a lot of these speeches, starting from Phaedrus' speech, where so much of the praise of the beloved was, in fact, a praise of love's ability to confront death, to accept death, if that's what love calls for. This theme of the connection between love and some confrontation or overcoming of mortality is also front and center in Socrates' own speech. Socrates learned from Diotima that erotic desire is a kind of neediness that can be fully satisfied only by a kind of happiness that is never fleeting, that would essentially be permanent. Now, for beings like us who will die, that means that erotic love looks to stretch out beyond ourselves, beyond our own life. So that a central part of erotic desire, an aspect of the desire itself, is some aspiration to live on beyond the bounds of our mortality. This is one of the central ways, then, that Diotima sees erotic desire as linked to the divine. The human way of making contact with the divine is through an erotic reaching out to the immortal. And the form that this takes in human beings is the form of reproduction, or the form of creativity. Now, it's striking how this both picks up the themes of Aristophanes' speech, but also transforms them. You remember when we focused on Aristophanes' speech, we talked about the way that in Aristophanes, the human erotic desire for reunion, for that kind of intimacy, that coupling, was fundamentally separate from a divine purpose that had been superimposed on the physical expression of that erotic coupling. Aristophanes eroticized broken human beings do produce offspring, are procreative in their search for union. But the desire for offspring in and of itself is not, in Aristophanes' speech, a part of the erotic drive. By contrast, in Diotima's account of the erotic drive, the sort of union we seek with another human being in erotic life has within it this search for immortality, this overcoming of the bonds of death that we live inside. So that as Diotima sees erotic love, when we look into the eyes of the beloved and feel that rush of emotion and desire that we call falling in love, when we fully articulate what's behind that rush of desire, we find that it includes creativity, reproduction. So, a topic that Aristophanes' speech has brought into the conversation is now developed to a much higher level of erotic intensity by Socrates' own speech. By the way, this is also a way that Socrates' speech makes use of Agathon's preceding speech. Agathon's speech had presented the creativity of the love poet as a central aspect of the human experience of the erotic. Socrates, in his speech, takes that up and inserts it into Aristophanes' picture of a fundamentally androgynous romantic existence. The way that Plato develops this new picture of Eros is especially striking. Let me just point to a couple of passages. First of all, I want to look on page 45 of our translation. This is at 202. The way that Diotima pushes the question on Socrates is to ask him whether love is a god. Agathon, of course, had presented love as the youngest and most beautiful and most philanthropic of all the gods. Diotima teaches Socrates differently. It turns out that love is not a god. Neither is love something simply mortal. Love is instead a being, a spirit. The Greek word is a daimon, where we get the word for demon. Love is a daimon that is between the human and the divine. Indeed, love is that mediating force that lifts humans toward the gods and that allows gods to descend toward humans. Here again we see the theme of divination, of our erotic life as somehow intimately bound up with the possibilities of human transcendence of the mundane or the everyday in the direction of something understood as sacred, as godly. So, as Diotima presents the god, or rather more precisely, the daimon, Eros, the spirit Eros, it turns out that the erotic life is a fundamentally philosophical life. This is in the middle of page 47 at 204a. Diotima says, the case stands thus: no god philosophizes or desires to become wise, for he is wise. Nor, if there exists any other being who is wise, does he philosophize. The philosophers on Diotima's picture are the exemplary case of those living an erotic life, because they're restlessly bound into a constant cycle of seeking wisdom. And of course, the Greek word philosophy means a lover of wisdom. It doesn't mean someone who is wise. It means someone who seeks wisdom. The picture of this restless seeker of wisdom that Diotima gives in her gorgeous myth of the parents of Eros is clearly modeled on Socrates himself. To mention only one striking aspect of this modeling, Eros, in this myth of his birth, turns out to have no shoes. One of the most striking habits of Socrates, who, as you remember, is almost always barefoot. so that when Aristodemus came across him at the beginning of the dialogue with his fancy party slippers on, Aristodemus notes it as something very much atypical. So Socrates, like all the other speakers in the dialogue, is presenting Eros in his own image and likeness. This daimonic Eros, this Eros that's in between the human and the divine, is itself an image of the philosophical life as Socrates experiences it, as he lives it out. It's striking to notice that in the myth that Diotima tells of the parentage of the god Eros, this is on page 46, starts around 203b. It's striking that in this particular myth, Diotima, or rather Socrates in his report of Diotima, directly contradicts Pausanias' speech. You remember that Pausanias presents us with two goddesses named Aphrodite. A heavenly Aphrodite, whose parentage is wholly male, and an earthy Aphrodite, whose parentage is both male and female, androgynous. The story that Diotima adopts is of love being given birth to androgynously by a mother and a father. This theme of the integration of the masculine and the feminine continues as Diotima, or Socrates through Diotima, describes the experience of what is famously called here giving birth in the beautiful. The notion is, as Diotima develops it, that we all feel erotic desire, not simply for other people as beautiful, but rather we have a profound desire for creativity. And we experience a provocation to and an energy for that kind of creativity when we're in the presence of someone we consider beautiful. So that Eros is not a desire for merely the possession of the beloved. That would be a rather poor, a rather vulgar version of erotic desire. Erotic desire instead is propelled by our desire to give birth in the company of somebody beautiful, so that we experience our beloved as that person with whom we can give birth. The language that Diotima uses for this giving birth is strikingly a combination of male sexual images, images of ejaculation, and female images of giving birth. So that, for example, on page 51, this is around 206e. Diotima says, to one pregnant, and the picture is that we're all pregnant, either physically or spiritually, to one pregnant and, as it were, already bursting with the load of his desire, the impulse towards that which is beautiful is intense on account of the great pain of retaining that which he has conceived. So this sexualized image of what's fundamentally a kind of spiritual procreativity is meant to be neither primarily male nor primarily female. It's meant to combine the male and the female into one potent image of an erotic life that can't be fully controlled within the macho categories originally introduced by the speakers in this dialogue. That we need a set of categories that bring directly into erotic desire the aspects of reproduction and pregnancy that were originally introduced into this dialogue by Aristophanes' speech. Diotima directly addresses her difference with Aristophanes' speech. The question is, in erotic desire, do we desire what is good, or do we desire what is our own? This passage actually begins on the bottom of page 49, around 205e. Diotima says to Socrates, "It is asserted by some that they love who are seeking the lost half of their divided being. But I assert that love is neither the love of half or of the whole, unless, my friend, it meets with that which is good. Since men willingly cut off their own hands and feet if they think that they are the cause of evil to them." This is a fundamental difference about the nature of our falling in love with other people. When we fall in love with somebody and we say, "That person is my soulmate, that person completes me," to use the Jerry Maguire line, "You're my other half," do we mean by that that the other person simply returns us to some state of wholeness, without any regard to whether that state of wholeness or completeness would itself be a good thing? When we fall in love with somebody, are we simply looking for someone who, so to speak, puts us in our comfort zone, who makes us feel at home, so that we're not lonely anymore? But of course, not being lonely is perfectly consistent with being incredibly lazy. It may well be that we feel comfortable with someone exactly when that person does not provoke in us any restless aspirations to be better, to be as good as we can. Do we seek in our lovers, in our beloveds, in our friends, that prod to our ambition, to our aspiration, that Diotima seems to presuppose in her critique of Aristophanes? Do we look for love to be the grounds of a restless seeking of a self that's not fully realized yet, something that lies latent in our potential? We talked about how in the Phaedrus it seems that the lover sees the beloved through the eyes of aspiration. It is what the beloved can become that is, from the lover's point of view, the beloved's truest self. Diotima, too, seems to assume some such view. And she sees it as a challenge to Aristophanes' emphasis on erotic wholeness, on the notion that's healing a wound rather than driving an aspiration that accounts for the central importance of falling in love in human lives. The last passage that I want to look at in Socrates' speech, the speech he learned from Diotima, is the most famous part of it. It starts on page 55 at the bottom. This is at 210a. Diotima says to Socrates, "Your own meditations, O Socrates, might perhaps have initiated you in all these things." Notice that this is set up as a religious initiation into a mystery. "Might have initiated you in all these things which I have already taught you on the subject of love. But those perfect and sublime ends to which these are only the means, I know not that you would have been competent to discover. I will declare them, therefore, and will render them as intelligible as possible. Do you, meanwhile, strain all your attention to trace the obscure depth of the subject. The notion of obscure depth drives us back to the passage at 192d, where the god Vulcan came down to the bedded lovers in Aristophanes' speech and asked them what the truth of their desire was. But it was too obscure for them to put words on. It escaped their ability to use speech. Here too, Diotima tries to help Socrates find words for something that goes beyond his unaided capacity. She gives a famous account here of how, with the right erotic guide, and that's crucial to this part of the dialogue, with the right person guiding you, your erotic interest in one beautiful individual will gradually expand into an erotic interest in knowledge as such, into some peak of erotic experience, a peak at which we never stay, but the aspiration to climb this ladder or this stairway of love is something that makes us always aspirational when we're lovers and beloveds. Never people who are simply comfortable with what we've already attained. Again, we see aspects of the same sort of thought about the aspirational character of erotic love in Plato's Phaedrus, when in the act of recollection through the beauty of the beloved, the lover is driven back to that experience before we were embodied in mythical time, when we had a fleeting vision of the sacred or most divine or most permanent objects of knowledge as we spun around at the top of the world in the train of a god. We talked earlier in Aristophanes' speech about the issue of whether we love a particular individual or whether we love a type of human being. The Ladder of Love passage pushes this question in a very potent way. Many readers of this passage feel that the ascent of the lover from the love of one particular beloved toward the love of something that looks as abstract as the sacred or highest objects of Platonic knowledge, whatever they may be. It looks like the ascent is primarily an ascent into impersonality, so that by the time we're at the top, the beloved is no more than one drop in the great sea of beauty, as Diotima describes it. But it's important to remember that one result of making this erotic ascent is the profound desire for creativity with someone we love. A creativity that may be primarily, let's call it, spiritual or psychic. The pursuit of, say, philosophical conversation. But a pursuit that also has as its image the physical reproduction of children. So while it's true that there is a kind of depersonalizing or impersonal aspect of this erotic ascent, making this erotic ascent is supposed to produce the most intimate relationship that one could have with another human being. That intimacy is predicated on the notion that the truest self, both of lover and beloved, is something that must be achieved, something that's never merely there to be discovered. When we want to be most completely known, most exposed to, most naked before the gaze of those we love, we don't seek merely to be discovered in what we are now. Rather, we want to be seen with the eyes of the lover, the eyes of the lover that sees within us, at least as the Phaedrus claims, something more divine than we ever would have seen in ourselves, unaided. So, Socrates' speech, the speech he learns from the woman Diotima, pulls together themes that have occurred in all of the preceding speeches. It also touches on, in its own way, a number of themes we've seen in Plato's Phaedrus. The challenge of whether love, by being aspirational, will also be depersonalized, indeed dehumanized, is a challenge that Plato realizes. And the concluding speech in the dialogue, the great speech of that wonderful drunk, Alcibiades, is Plato's attempt to meditate on the costs and the benefits of an aspirational erotic life. So when we return again to the symposium, to Alcibiades' concluding speech, we'll also return to this set of issues. On Wednesday, I will be talking about a couple of passages from J.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, along with some clips from the movie. I will actually email you one extract from the Lord of the Rings so that you can see that. Those of you unfamiliar with either the movie or the text, I think you'll still be able to find the primary themes intelligible. See you then.